Welcome to the Better Learning Podcast, brought to you by AFRLE. I'm your host, Carla Cummins, and I'm thrilled to guide you through today's conversation about a topic that's critical to the future of education. That topic's improving infrastructure for savings, resilience, and better education. We're diving into why high-performance school buildings matter, how they impact student outcomes, and most importantly, how we can make them a reality without breaking the bank. So today, joining me are three incredible experts. We have Jana, Phoebe, and Sarah, each bringing a unique experience and insight to how infrastructure improvements, policy shifts, and thoughtful design can support sustainability and equity in our school. So let's get started today. I wanted to first, have Sarah kind of start the conversation off on, we can take it over to you so that maybe you can introduce us a little bit to Jana and Phoebe and the topic today.
Great. Thanks, Carla. Hi, Phoebe. Hi, Jana. How are you guys today?
Good.
So nice to
Thanks,
see you. I'm excited for this conversation. So I think you guys know I'm kind of the new kid to the block here. I've, really enjoyed learning from experts like you, Jana and Phoebe, as I've come into this whole world of school buildings and health and cost savings. But I feel like you couldn't be a parent in the United States with kids in school and not appreciate just how important the school building is to the health and learning that happens, for our young people. So I'm certainly a learner when it comes to space. Jenna, I know you've been in this work for years now. Can you just help us orient to what is the current state of our school buildings right now? Kind of where are we in the world if we just step back from the keyhole of that COVID experience that a bunch of us had as parents?
So it's really interesting because the vast majority of our schools, and it honestly does not matter where you are. Like, I live up here in just outside of Boston. So if you look at Boston, Cambridge, Newton, or if you go anywhere in the Midwest, my firm DLR Group has offices all over the country. And so been fortunate to be able to walk a lot of schools in the past 5 years. And they are all in disrepair, deferred maintenance. They were built in the 60s, 70s. There was another group of schools that were built in the 80s. And honestly, new schools today were built in the late 90s, early 2000s, which means there's still, all of those systems are at the end of their useful life, but the vast majority of them are 40 to 60 years old. And they just look bad. Puerto Rico, the schools I walked in Puerto Rico honestly don't look that much different from the schools that I walked in, Boston public schools right out here in the Northeast. And you would think there would be more difference, but there's just not, because the deferred maintenance is the deferred maintenance.
Yeah. Yeah. Phoebe, was there a report? Did I see some news about a report that just came out the other day giving us our grade?
Yeah, it's not good. So I think the national average is C+ for infrastructure grade across the country. That's like water infrastructure, roads, bridges. Schools got a D+ grade, which is on par with past years. And so, to Jana's point, the amount of deferred maintenance is insurmountable. And that's why, as you mentioned, Sarah, during COVID, there was an influx of funding to address some of this infrastructure gap. And it was a really important influx of funding that is now dried up. And so back at the same situation where we have this big gap and issue that is national, and the infrastructure funds are limited to make those improvements.
But I
and
feel
it impacts health, right? It impacts health and performance of the students, which is why we're talking about this today.
Yeah. And I feel like we're not even back to where we started, because actually the world around us is changing. I think all of us happen to be up in the Northeast, but across the country, we know that there's, things like wildfire smoke that schools, buildings now need to contend with. There's hotter days when we go back to school in August and where we're trying to finish up school in May and June. And so, the bar and what our school buildings have to contend with is actually a moving target, and it's moving in ways that are making the world more challenging for the old buildings, Jana, that you talked about that are not up to snuff. So Phoebe, you're at the Center for Green Schools. What is a green school? Can you talk about that a little bit and why it's important?
Yeah. So when people think of green schools or sustainable schools, they often think like solar panels or a garden. It's much more complex than that. And I think that's part of the challenge with understanding it. But when we think about a green school, we're really defining it in three parts. The first is about reduced environmental impact and cost. So it's reducing its impact on energy and water usage. It has a complex recycling and composting program potentially. Decisions are made with carbon in mind. So how can we make a decision with a retrofit project or a new roof, whatever it might be, as you're upgrading your building? Does this impact our greenhouse gas emission positively or negatively? It's also one that's healthy and promotes health and wellness around for students and staff. So we do a lot of work at the Center for Green Schools on air quality in schools, especially post-COVID. We know that good air quality in school buildings translates to better performance of students and staff. And so green, healthy schools are ones that have good air quality, have water that is drinkable, and promotes health and wellness with nutrition and physical activity opportunities. And while we're the Green Building Council, we definitely prioritize and focus a lot on the importance of those buildings connecting students to learning opportunities. So we can build beautiful, healthy buildings, but if we're not helping the building occupants understand environmental sustainability, connect to why those buildings are green, why that's important. It might feel good, but why does it feel better, right? I walked to school yesterday in Arlington High School, and seeing the before and after photos of what that school has transformed to be for that community, for those students, you just feel good when you're there. And that's it's on track for being certified as LEED Platinum. So that's a complex picture of what a green school is, but it's important that all of those pieces are considered and addressed to be healthy and high performing. And I didn't mention resiliency because that's a topic that, as you mentioned, wildfire smoke. I mean, the world is only getting hotter. And so resiliency and being able to withstand storms is another big factor that we see school systems addressing.
I think it's really interesting that clients run the gamut. Some clients are asking for it, and then they are really being we know we need to do this because and here in the Northeast, we don't necessarily have, wildfires, but we do have storms. We have too much water. Other places in the country have too little. We oftentimes have too much, although right now Massachusetts does happen to be in a drought, but still relatively speaking, those storms and flooding and things like that. So, it's interesting to me that I still hear clients that say, I don't care about sustainability. I work with a lot of teams all across the country. Part of my job is to do that, to support them in achieving high performance buildings for the clients. I sit there and say, what are the barriers? Why aren't we doing this day in and day out? It's oh, my client doesn't care. Or I meet with clients and they say, it costs too much. And I really think that we need to challenge that because it's been proven over and over again. And you can look at a report by Built Environment Plus here in Massachusetts that proves that it does not cost more. I will say that they're coming at, there are both rich and poor communities that are looking for this. I will say that I, work with the city of Cambridge. I have for many years. They were pushed to this from grassroots efforts. They're a pretty affluent community. But then I also am working with the USVI, Virgin Islands Department of Education, and they're coming from what you just said, Phoebe, that resiliency aspect. Their schools were devastated in 2017. They're only just now getting the funding to build those back. And they're pushing for those high performance schools, those, very resilient, very low energy use because of where they are. They don't have money for the energy, for the electricity, because it's so expensive on the island. So there's two very different perspectives, but they're still ultimately coming up with the exact same thing of these high performing, healthy schools that cost less to operate. So I think it's just, really all tied together. I will say though, that if you invest in the things that last longest, like your envelope, that also make you the most healthy, like the right amount of windows and a really good tight, make it tight so that it keeps people warm and dry just by existing, like the exterior of the building just sits there for years and keeps people warm and dry if it's, done well, as opposed to paying for the things that people have to maintain. You could actually reduce the cost of your first cost of the building and definitely reduce the long-term costs. We have many examples of that, as do I'm sure you, Phoebe.
Yeah. So at the Center for Green Schools, we are a department within the U.S. Green Building Council, which is best known for the LEED Green Building Rating System. Many of DLR projects are LEED certified schools and other buildings across the country, across the world. And we have over 5,000 schools that are certified or registered as LEED across the country. We have studies to back up what Jana mentioned that like designing to a green building standard does not have to cost more. And when you do it right and prioritize upfront planning and really have your values and goals set at the start of a project, it can cost less. And ultimately, you are saving every year with reduced maintenance and an operational cost. And for a school system, that's what you get stuck with, right? You have a bond that you might pass. Your community says, yes, we want a new building or upgraded building. Our students deserve it. Awesome. Let's design something beautiful, build something beautiful. Ultimately, they're left with the operational costs. And so if you can reduce those for the project owner, that's the best thing long-term for taxpayers and for the community. And so that's our goal of the Center for Green Schools and the USGBC is to really promote design and buildings of high performance that reduce costs long-term and are durable, as Jana mentioned, and high performing. I can talk all day about it, but when it comes to schools in particular, the costs we know are really a big issue. And so being diligent up front to make sure you're planning well to keep that in mind is important. And we see that when we talk about rural schools, right? Some schools just don't have access to consultants or contractors to repair complex systems. And so the thinking and strategy is very manual, very simple, and you can design a really beautiful, healthy building with those systems as well as a fancy, sophisticated building.
Oftentimes, simple pictures are best. And again, I like to tell my teams, well, how would you design this building if you didn't have any power? Like, how does it survive when the power goes out? What is the best design possible? And when you shift that thinking, that's where these communities that can't spend money on the fancy systems, like again, making them as small as possible, making them as simple as possible, and really designing to their ability to maintain it. I mean, it sounds corny, but I have for years been saying, you can't sustain it if you can't maintain it. Like sustainability does not exist if people cannot actually keep their buildings and performing the way that they're supposed to.
Yeah, Jana, one of the things that keeps coming up with us and our members who are school districts nationally who are focused on sustainability is this like myth around geothermal system or ground source heating and cooling systems, which have been around for hundreds of years. And as a technology is used in certain parts of the country, like the Midwest, as the go-to heating and cooling source. But in a lot of places, there's a lot of myths around it because it's newer technology. And Sarah, I know that you've been working with school systems nationally to promote the Inflation Reduction Act funding, which incentivizes geothermal systems in schools because it's a simple system to maintain, but it has this myth about it because it's new and different. Can you talk a little bit about what you've been hearing from schools around that technology?
Yeah, absolutely. New and different is scary for all of us. And you're right, we have this great opportunity. Jana, as you were talking about kind of simple systems, I was reminded of a story that I heard about an engineering firm that started designing schools with geothermal systems for a rural district, in Kentucky that didn't have access to, fancy technical support. And this is just going to be the simplest system for them to operate. So you're right, Phoebe, when it's unfamiliar, we assume it must be complex. But in fact, these systems can be really simple to operate. And now, and this is still news to lots of folks, schools have access to an unlimited, non-competitive set of federal dollars to reduce the first cost of these most efficient systems. So the federal government will reimburse schools for 30, 40, sometimes 50% of the cost of these HVAC systems, which in addition to being efficient, they also do two things for us, right? They heat and they cool our building. So it's a 2-for-1. that's moving heat instead of making heat, so a much more efficient machine. And now we get the federal government to help us pay for it. So we were really excited to hear about Seattle Public Schools. They were one of the first school districts that, they happened to already be in process with 3 schools that were doing geothermal. They were in the right place at the right time to be one of the first school districts to take advantage of these new federal dollars. They got a check from the IRS for $7.9 million the other day for 3 geothermal systems that they installed. And now they get to reinvest those dollars in the next project, improve the next school for the next generation of young people. What's exciting is that, it's not just the large urban districts like Seattle. I appreciate they're a large district. We've seen small rural districts that have, 5 buildings, and, they've also been able to access this new federal funding source. So we're really excited that this is an opportunity that school leaders can start to strategize around how they make the most of over the next decade. And we're excited that it's starting to bring this thermal technology into conversations and have more of a robust kind of discussion around whether it might be the fit, and it won't be the best fit in all cases. But we're excited that it's kind of bringing this most efficient system into discussions, more often. So we're hoping we can continue to have this funding source available for schools for decades to come. Jana, are you seeing our schools that you're working with start to take
Oh, yeah.
advantage of these tax
Yeah.
credits?
Yes, absolutely. And again, as you mentioned, it's so interesting how there are certain things that start on the East Coast and they work their way in. But in terms of the ground source heat pumps, the geothermal systems, they started in the Midwest. And like I said, that has go to Nebraska, Iowa, Minnesota, the Dakotas. That is their go-to system that they do them all day long. Nobody asks them to do it. It's what they do because it is that system for where they are located. So I think it's just funny how things work that way. But yes, we're seeing them everywhere. We work with Seattle Public Schools. We have an office in Seattle. We are doing one of their elementary schools right now, as well as then in other places. I will though reiterate, it is not the magic bullet for all locations.
Sure.
You will have places where the soils aren't right. You have too much rock. There's all these other kinds of things. But that does not mean that there still isn't a system out there for you that can be really efficient. And, and there are other things out there, whether it's PVs and the credits for PVs or whatever, as well as whatever your local utilities. I always tell people, have you gone to the website Desire? DSIRE. It's a database of state incentives for, I always forget what it stands for. It's a long thing, but look up DSIRE or the Energy Star websites, and they have lists of incentives in your local area. I mean, in Mass Save, I feel, here in Massachusetts is got an incredible program of incentives that they've been helping schools now for years and years, and not just schools, other project types as well. There are incentives all over the place if you go and you just find them and what's available in your area, even if it's not wrapped into necessarily using the words decarbonization. It's still about infrastructure upgrades, resiliency, and making these buildings and getting them into shape so that they will, withstand the next tornado or hurricane or whatever it is, heat wave, COVID. Suddenly COVID made HVAC systems sexy. We needed that.
They did. They did. Can we talk about existing buildings for a little bit? Because I feel like we haven't necessarily differentiated, great to build a new building like Seattle's doing with ground source heat pumps. What are we thinking about kind of existing buildings and how our focus maybe needs to shift there and the strategies there for existing buildings?
Let's face it, the vast majority of our building stock has already been built. Even if we sat around and built or made every single new building from going forward from this point, net zero, we would not even scratch the surface of the schools out there that need help. So yes, and it's not always easy to just switch out and say, we're going to switch out from one system to another. It is complicated, but there are more and more programs that are focusing on that. And again, while you're looking at those systems upgrade, what can you do to the exterior? I cannot emphasize enough how those two things are intertwined. Whether it, in an existing building, it's about finding all the holes in the building. Where are you losing heat or gaining heat, depending on which climate you're in? How's the air passing through? How can you change the windows? Does it make sense to add insulation or not? There are some historic buildings where it actually wouldn't make sense because they were built in a way that, honestly, they were built in ways that oftentimes outperform buildings that were built in the 80s and 90s when things got a little sketchy in the industry. Let's face it. Let's not sugarcoat it. But working hand in hand to make that envelope tight and work the way it's supposed to, and then adding the most efficient systems possible.
Yeah.
Adding ventilation. I don't think people realize maybe they do now after COVID, but they don't realize that the vast majority of school buildings did not have ventilation. The way you ventilate those buildings was you went over and you put the window up. And how many schools have I been into? And the windows are painted shut.
Right.
They're not nailed shut, but they're painted shut in these old buildings. So definitely we need to focus on that. But again, ultimately, your focus is similar. It's just that the solutions may be different. The way that you tighten that envelope will be different than maybe you do in a new building.
At some point along the way, I heard the phrase, every building is a snowflake, And so I feel like for every building, we need to figure out that set of puzzle pieces, that set of strategies that's going to get us from where it sits today to the place where we want it to be for the sake of the health of students, educators, and really the whole community that depends on those buildings to be resilient, safe places.
Have you ever wondered how a simple change in your classroom can revolutionize learning? At K-12, we believe the physical space is key. When we partnered with Gary Community Schools in Indiana, something incredible happened. Their classrooms were outdated and uninspiring. Using our radically student-centered approach, we reimagined their spaces. The transformation was nothing short of amazing. Teachers saw immediate results, students came back from winter break excited, more engaged, collaboration increased, and overall performance improved. One student even shared, "We have new furniture, it's like Christmas all over again." On the first day back, local media came in to cover the story, capturing the joy and excitement of students discovering their new learning environments. See how we can transform your school today. Visit kay-twelve.com to learn more about our innovative approach. K-12, because every student deserves an inspiring place to learn. Visit kay-twelve.com today.
Phoebe, how do you think about the snowflake?
It's beautiful and also really challenging, right? And that's something we do a lot of operational efficiencies with schools, and like that's definitely unique too, right? Like you can't have the same recycling and composting system in one school as another, just because it is so unique in terms of how they operate. But when we're talking about the infrastructure, we actually had a meeting with about 60 school district staff earlier this week, asking them the question, what are your biggest challenges when it comes to renovating and greening existing schools? So the top three options or challenges for them were very much in line with what we were just talking about. So the sexy HVAC system. So how do we upgrade HVAC systems in our existing buildings to be super high performing? Is it a geothermal system, or how do we like retrofit with air source heat pumps, potentially fit those new systems in an existing building? Second on the list was making the case for renovation versus new construction. So the impact of carbon in the built environment and our buildings is becoming more and more important for the leading school districts that are driving sustainability change. And so we talk about carbon, we're talking about the embodied carbon in a building. So it takes carbon to operate a building, right, in terms of energy and water use. But there's a lot of carbon that's stored in that building that went into the materials that were used to build it. And then when you make decisions about retrofitting, is it going to tear that building down and build new, or are you going to try to renovate and keep some of that infrastructure? There's cost implications, but there's also carbon implications, and those things are becoming more of a priority for a lot of school districts in their decision making. So another like snowflake piece too. And then that third one was building envelope improvement, because I feel like this is the real nut to crack, is like how do you add on to a building shell without totally taking it apart, right? To improve the weatherization of it or improve insulation. So I'm excited for some more examples of K-12 school projects that are doing that well. We're going to be talking about that in Chicago in a couple of weeks, trying to point to more examples of that.
Well, I think I walk away with two. Jenny, you had a good rhyme. And then Sarah, every school's a snowflake. I've never heard that. But even in my history, right? And walking through facilities, you see that. So I got everyone's background, Sarah, but I was interested because I don't know, and this is sheer ignorance on my side. So Sarah Ross, where are you from?
I'm from Massachusetts and I'm with a nonprofit called Undaunted K-12, and
Okay.
we're trying to support schools to really become more energy efficient, healthier, more sustainable. We want to work towards a future where every student has the opportunity to learn in a safe, healthy, resilient school building.
Yeah. So is this a new path for you? And this might be just something I mispulled from it because you're like, I'm just a parent. Jen and Phoebe have the experts. So did I miss something? Did I misinterpret it? Or is this something that you came into naturally? Is it something that you've done for a very long time?
I'm 4.5 years into this work compared to decades for these
Yeah.
women. So that's why I'm still the new kid on the block, 4.5
Okay.
years in. So
Okay.
But Sarah had experience in doing renewable energy projects, solar projects.
yeah, I had experience doing solar finance before, so kind of knew something about clean energy technologies and finance, and helping to kind of help decision makers, in my case of my previous gig, like homeowners, figure out how to understand the opportunities that clean energy and some of these sustainable strategies affords. And now I get to do that with school leadership folks. So just this morning I sat down with my own kids' school at my own middle school where I went to school. And I said, hey, so, we've been band-aiding this HVAC system for how long now? I think since I was a student here. It's probably
Yeah.
about time we make a plan for making a change and, moving from these legacy systems to a modern high performance system. And, these are some of the steps that we're going to need to think about, both from a building perspective, but also just from a stakeholder perspective. Yeah, how do we help the members of the school board understand why this work is important? How are we going to sell these investments to the community and help them understand what's in it for them to invest in a new HVAC system or to put solar on the roof of the middle school? What's in it for them? Is it savings on their tax dollars? Is it, a school that can be an emergency shelter, for issues? So really trying to talk with them about the whole process of breathing new life into school buildings that I walk the halls of.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you guys. So, and I think it brings us to an end. Did we miss anything? Are there any other tidbits that we want to talk about?
I think the only thing that we didn't talk about is the decision-making process for how to, like, when you have a district, big districts, city of New York, for instance, or, Philadelphia, these places where it's not just 20 schools, it's 1,500 schools.
Mm-hmm.
How do you make choices? Because again, all of their schools, the vast majority of them need help. So how do you make choices? And I will say that is something that for me recently, like what have I learned in the last 5 years is about different ways of thinking about it. Historically, those choices were made, you focus on the worst first. The worst building gets the most attention. And in the last few years in the projects that I've done, we've reimagined how to get to those answers based on who will it impact the most.
Okay.
And historically, districts would close schools in the underserved communities when they got too bad. They wouldn't make the investment there and they would put the dollars somewhere else or, for other reasons. And when you actually invest in those communities, those are the communities that are typically those underserved communities are the ones that are currently located next to the highway, next to the airport, next to the industrial park, next to whatever it is in rural communities that's next to the chicken farm or the hog farm, and when you invest in those and you make a difference in their air quality and you make a difference in those kinds of things, the impact is actually tenfold on those kids in those environments versus, say, the affluent neighborhood. The other thing is the role those schools play in those communities is actually different. They don't have other resources. So I've definitely switched, just in the mindset of let's make sure we're investing first. Not that everybody shouldn't have investment, but we have to make choices. You have to pick your first project, your next project, your next project. Let's make sure we're hitting those places where we're going to have the greatest impact and help the most people before we just make it like worst first and just look at it in a very narrow, a narrow way.
Yeah, on our side, right? We don't necessarily do energy on my day-to-day job, but ultimately we hear the conversation on equity all the time. And if you can't make the decision on making every school equitable when you have 1,500 schools, you're then they're just like, well, we can't do it at all because we can't get it across the
Right.
district or anything else like that. And that's a conversation that we breach every single day is like, what does that look like in our public education system? And that equity piece is a huge component of it. But having a starting point and a baseline and just the understanding of the impact that it has for an overall community is massive.
And definitely just establishing a framework for making decisions. Like
Yep.
every district, as they approach these projects, should have criteria to look at the project and say, thumbs up or thumbs down.
Right.
Does it make sense? And talking about what is important to them in making those decisions makes it less emotional and makes it more objective. Like, okay, it meets the following criteria. And obviously, it's very important to get that criteria right.
Mhm.
That's the advice that I would always give to a district is define what is important and how you're going to make those decisions. Because I've never gone to a district, never seen a district that says, yep, we can just do all these projects. There's always choices to be made. And you have to have a clear decision-making path to know what level of investment makes sense at each location and which projects are going to go first, second, and third, and so on.
I'll also add that, the climate is helping. There's a lens of decision-making that's being driven by climate change. And every year is hotter than the last. And we know that students who are most vulnerable are in communities that don't have trees and are vulnerable to heat. And so compared to their more affluent counterparts, they're 6% more likely to be in schools with inadequate air conditioning. And when we talk about equity and then performance, right? There's data now that is driving this decision-making at these districts that's showing that hotter schools actually impact test performance. And there's many studies that have been happening more recently, but there's a study that tracked 10 million secondary students taking the PSAT. That 1 degree hotter school year reduced that year's performance by 1%. So the learning percentage by 1%. So we all can feel it, right? So, I remember in high school, I took the SAT in a gym with huge fans. It was hard to concentrate. And that was a long time ago. So it's real. And heat is becoming a real stressor in many ways. So anyway, I just want to mention that's a decision-making point that is becoming a bigger reality for a lot of school systems, especially in the Northeast and Pacific Northwest that don't have air conditioning typically.
Well, that brings us to an end of this episode of the Better Learning Podcast. So I'm so grateful that Jana, Phoebe, and Sarah joined me and shared such powerful examples and strategies. We know that the path to better school infrastructure isn't always clear, much like Jana pointed out, but today's conversation showed that the right priorities, partnerships, and creativity is absolutely possible. So join us. We're going to be continuing this conversation at the upcoming A4LE Symposium in Washington, D.C., June 24th through 26th. So in there, you're going to find more actionable insights and real-world examples tailored to your school or your district that you can actually implement and to get help and resources from a lot of the participants who will be there. So on that closing, make sure that you subscribe to the Better Learning Podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen, or visit our webpage at k12.com to stay connected and explore more. Thank you so much for listening.
The Better Learning Podcast is produced by Matt Rogers and edited by Kelly Jones. The views and opinions shared on this podcast are those of the individual speaking and do not necessarily represent the perspectives of their affiliated companies, organizations, or associations.